So it's my pleasure then to welcome Nik Ribianszky, who is a senior lecturer in history at Queen's University Belfast, an expert in pre-Civil War African American history. Their talk today is going to focus on a group of people who have been described by historians, I'm told, as living, quote, ambiguous lives, or, quote, in the margins, or, quote, in shadow, and whose freedom was often illusory prior to the Civil War in the US, and that is free Black people. Nick's talk is entitled The Continuing Development of Generations of Freedom, the Natchez Database of Free People of Color, 1779 to 1865. They will speak for roughly 30 minutes, I believe, broadly speaking, by giving us a kind of dive into some of the infrastructures that have underpinned that database, after which we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Like I said, this is being recorded, so that may change the way in which you want to frame your questions, or it may not, but it's worth just noting that there. And I will hand over to Nik without further ado.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the kind intro, and I very much appreciate getting the invite to come and speak before this group and sharing my work. And as you mentioned, I have been looking at this community of free people of color or free Black people. I use both terms interchangeably in Natchez for going on 30 years. I first visited Natchez back in 1994. I'm obviously an American. I live in Belfast. I've lived there for 7 years, but haven't gotten any of the lovely accent yet. I will probably, go to the grave with this Michigan accent. But it's been a long time since I first started examining this group of fascinating people. So I would like to share, for 30 minutes, I'm going to be watching the clock to make sure that I don't go over. But this project has gone through many different iterations since I first began it as a master's student formally in 1995. And I was looking at initially the community for free women of color who own property. That's kind of how I came into the topic. And I'll discuss some of the specificities with that and show just different iterations of the database that grew from that initial work on 59 women who owned property in Natchez to, as it stands right now, a database that incorporates 1,022 people. So I am going to be starting out with a story, and I've got hopefully everybody can see this without any issues. This is the website that along with one of my, he was a master's student at the time, Pierce McGee, helped create and put the framework together for this website. And in the spirit of digital humanities, trying to think of the best ways to share information, to tell stories, to honor the people that it's based upon. This is what we came up with, and I do expect that it will be subject to some change. I'm just warning you also that I can see 5 miles in the distance probably, but I can't see the hand in front of my face many times, so I will be going in between my glasses and off. So as James kindly said, this is an account of the evolution of a project that had its origins in 1994 when I first went to Natchez, and I got a gift, and it was the diary that this man, William Johnson, for any of you who has either read about Natchez or visited Natchez, his house, the house that he and his family lived in Natchez, it's still standing there. He kept a diary from the years 1835 until his death in 1851. And I received the diary as a gift when I was visiting Natchez. And I was fascinated because it's, his account of his family. He and his wife, Ann Battles Johnson, had 10 children who lived, one that did not. And he talks about his family life. He talks about the businesses that he built there. He had 3 barber shops during his life. a wallpaper. He sold wallpaper, children's toys, water. He had a money lending business, and he also had a plantation on the outskirts of Natchez called Hardscrabble, which gives us a little bit of indication as to the type of soil that it had. But he was also, William Johnson was born into slavery, and he was freed after his mother, Amy, had been freed by their enslaver, who was also his father, and the person that Amy was involved with for many years. So William was freed along with his sister Adelia, and he himself and his family went on to hold enslaved people throughout his life. And then, after he died, his family continued on with that relationship. So when I got that diary, I was really looking at how he remembered the women in Natchez, the women in his family who were free women of color. There were some enslaved women in his family also, and enslaved women in the community, including people that were enslaved by his family, and also white women in the community and what their interactions were with the family. And so that's really how I got into it. And as I said, in my master's thesis, that my master's thesis was an attempt to tell the lives and the stories of these Natchez women whose voices, for the most part, have been muffled, silenced, and forgotten over the years. So from that time until this, I did expand my work to include the entire free Black community. And I really want to stress that I included those who enjoyed their legal freedom, as Johnson and his family did, but also people who may not have been formally freed. Manumission was an expensive and sort of troubled process. People went through a lot of trouble to do it. Sometimes they had to appear in front of the Mississippi State Legislature in order to do it, so it could be expensive. And some people simply gave up claim to the people that they had enslaved. So my work does take an inclusive look to this to this community. And a lot of times the documents themselves are only a line in the census indicating that somebody is a free Black person, or the language of the time, a free Negro. And sometimes they were involved in court cases where they were struggling for their freedom. Sometimes the court cases, in spite of the fact that many of them were very detailed, sometimes the outcome is not clear. So notwithstanding all of these ambiguities with it, I did include all of the people within the database. So the database, again, it is the Natchez Database of Free People of Color, the NDFPC. Who doesn't need another acronym in their lives? And then also the other tool that I developed at the same time was the Natchez Index of Free Individuals and Families of Color. So both of them go hand in hand, as I'll explain. And this paper really is a reflection of lessons that I've learned along the way, and of aspirations to improve and further develop what began as a traditional academic historical inquiry and has become a digital public history project, culminating in my website, which again, I would really like to continue developing. So I am going to start out with a story. And this is a woman who she was one of the free women of color who owned property in Natchez that I began examining in 1995, 1996, and wrote about. She is one of those people who is, a lot of her life is really shrouded in mystery. The great, question of, if you had one conversation with somebody who is deceased, who would it be? For me, for many years, she is the person that came to mind, because there are so many questions about her life that really remain unanswered. But I wrote about her in my master's thesis, and I'll talk about how that has, continued to develop over the years. So a little bit about her. Fannie Leeper, her name is. She was a free woman of color. She was a property holder, a washerwoman, and she was born into slavery in Natchez, Mississippi. The exact year of her birth is not now known. She was born to an enslaved woman, Hannah Fry, and to J.S. Miller, a white planter who lived outside of Natchez near the small town of Washington, Mississippi. Mrs. Margaret Overacre, a white woman, and her husband, George, owned Leeper and her mother. While Leeper was still a young girl, her mother was manumitted, and Leeper herself remained enslaved. Sometime around 1831, when Leeper was approximately 20 or 21, she was freed, reportedly at the insistence of her father, who paid Overacre $300. In 1834 or thereabouts, following the instructions of her white father, she was taken by boat up the Mississippi River to Cincinnati, Ohio, in the footsteps of her mother. As was the case with most property holding free women of color in Natchez, Fanny Leeper was of mixed race. As one Natchez resident put it, she appears at first to be of pretty near white blood, but when you come to converse with her, you discover the contrary. Since Leeper was known in Natchez as a free woman of color, her occupational choices were quite limited. She was employed at one point as a washerwoman. Her white father contributed to her support as well, and it is likely that her father financed her purchase of a house and lot in Natchez. In 1834, Leeper paid $100 to John R. Wells for a city lot located near the bluff, with the agreement that she would pay an additional installment of $75. She next contracted with the firms of Neighbor and Gemmel, and then Bryant and Luke, to construct a 6-room wood frame house. She hired Daniel Lippincott to build the brick chimney and piers upon which the house was supported. The property additionally consisted of a kitchen, an outhouse, and enclosures that, including the house, cost Leeper $1,562. In today's dollars, that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $56,388. It appears that she paid at least another $100 for fruit and ornamental trees to adorn the yard. All in all, the property that Leeper paid taxes on and occupied from 1834 to 1845 cost her nearly $2,000. Fanny Leeper's relationships with men had a significant impact on her experience as a free propertied woman. Apparently, in her young adulthood, she married a free mixed race man who gave her the surname of Leeper. It appears that he died shortly thereafter. It is unclear precisely when she began her relationship with another white man, Gustavus Howard, but Leeper did launder his clothes, we know this, and he lived with her periodically. There was a rumor circulating in Natchez that they were married, and it is quite possible that when Leeper moved to Cincinnati in 1845, Gustavus Howard went with her. Sorry. Too many papers here, my bad. I'm so sorry. Okay, apologies. These glasses, they're right at hand, but apparently they didn't save me there. One relationship, in addition to those mentioned already, that Leeper had with a man proved to be to cause her considerable grief. Sometime in the mid-1830s, Leeper began an association with Joseph Winscott, a white engineer on the steamboat Hail Columbia. He periodically passed through Natchez for a day or two at a time on his way up the Mississippi River from New Orleans or on the return trip. Some Natchez residents claimed to see him staying at Leeper's home quite comfortably while he was in town, and it was understood that she was his mistress for a number of possible reasons, including the fact that at various times in Natchez's history, it was very difficult for free people of color like Fanny Leeper to hold property in their own name. She decided to insert his name on the deed to her house. And this issue began, became a central question concerning the ownership of the lot and the house that sat upon it. In 1845, Leeper decided to move from Natchez to Cincinnati, Ohio. She hired an agent, Samuel R. Hammett, to manage her property, rent it out, and collect the monthly rent of $8 for her. It was not long after her departure that Malvina Huffman, another free woman of color who was passing as white in Natchez, and her friend and associate at various times, recognized the opportunity to take advantage of Leeper's absence in Natchez. In the latter part of 1846, Malvina Huffman's white lover, Oliver Bemis, disclosed to Hammett that he had purchased the property for Huffman from Joseph Winscott for $100 or $125. Later, Huffman requested that Hammett send her the keys. At that time, Hammett, not realizing that the transaction had occurred without Leeper's permission, surrendered the keys to Huffman, who took possession of the house. So in the next year, 1847, Leeper filed a petition against Huffman and her three associates for fraudulently cheating her out of her own property. Leeper charged that Huffman, with full knowledge of Winscott's name on the deed, falsely informed him that Leeper was in actuality a slave who could not hold property. She then convinced him that Leeper had fled Natchez and that the property was going to ruin. She maintained that since the property fully belonged to him and his name was on the deed, he could sell it to her. Thus, he did. Leeper informed the court that she had paid more than $1,700 for the property and could have sold it for at least $1,000. Huffman refused to remit the house and lot to Leeper, and further, she questioned Leeper's legal freedom. Leeper lost the case she brought before the Southern District Chancery Court in Natchez and was not entitled to any relief. However, she did appeal the decision before the Mississippi High Court of Error and Appeals and eventually won her claim that she had been wrongfully defrauded of her property. At this point, Fannie Leeper is lost in the historical record. I bring that story up for a reason. As I said, it was based on, she was one of the people that I based my master's thesis on as a woman who owned property in Natchez, and she really exhibited a lot of these kinds of vulnerabilities that free people of color faced. At various times, they could not hold property in their own name, and they had to insert a white person's name onto deeds. They had to have some sort of, a vouching of white people at various times, of sponsorship, of support, and that kind of thing. And at different times, including in the 1840s, when Leeper did decide to leave Natchez, it was at a part of time, an era that William Johnson termed the Inquisition, when free Black people were being questioned if they were actually free or if they were merely slaves without masters, as one scholar, Ira Berlin, termed people. And so at that time, some people were deported out of Natchez. Some people voluntarily decided to leave, and that was likely why Fannie Leeper went to Cincinnati. So I did want to focus on the website because this is, although I said that this work dates back to the 1990s, and I'm a traditionally trained historian. And luckily, like I said, I did have a wonderful grad assistant who can hear me. I just got a message saying that my Wi-Fi is struggling a little bit.
I was just going to say we lost a little bit of you when you started just moving across to the website. I think it's stabilized now, so take a pause.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much.
I think we're good.
So I do I want to kind of focus on the different iterations. I am aware of my time, 12 minutes to fit things in, but I think it would be useful since I was invited to talk about the database of which this is, this website. It's an integral part of this website. And this was one of the tools that really helped the various iterations to its present form. So I am going to show this, and hopefully you can all see this as well. This was the very first, and this database was never meant to be published, but I really want to kind of illustrate how my thinking evolved over time, how, lessons learned from people like, Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, who created a massive database about free and enslaved people in the lower Mississippi Valley back in the 90s, and whose work was very influential on mine. So this is very, you can see this was just really an organizational tool in so many ways. So there were 54 people at this point, and then I did add a few along the way, but I just simply listed their names, their race, according to the census categories of either mulatto or there was one Black woman, and then there were a couple, I'm sorry, two Black women, and then a couple whose race at that time was unclear. And then how much real estate they owned, how much personal estate that they owned, if they were enslavers, and how many they had in what particular year in the census that it was listed. And then if they were involved with, if they were involved in romantic, or if they were married, and what race that person that they were involved in a relationship with was, either mulatto. There were a lot of white men that free Black women were also involved with. And then their fathers, if I knew the race of their fathers. And then the last category, you can see how sophisticated these fields are that I developed at the time, how they procured their property. So this one right here, WF, meant a white female, and white female, and yeah. So this was the first iteration of my database. And then in the next iteration, this was when I decided to move out from the free Black property owning women of Natchez and transform it into a community study. I began my PhD work in 2005, and we can see that it expanded. There were several more fields that I developed. The last one is details. And I did continue, listing in alphabetical order. Sometimes an individual's surname was not given in the documents, but I still tried to maintain that alphabetical order just for myself. That was something that was very helpful. And then the color coding is really to try to indicate families, because this did become a family study along the way. And so whenever I encountered somebody that was not related to the person preceding them, I changed the color. And then the reason why there's a third color is because as the database expanded and new people were discovered in the documents, I would sometimes have to add them in the middle of the existing framework. And so then it was also important for me to indicate when the people were present in Natchez. So starting in the 1770s and going up to the 1860s. And then the type of record, this indicated a deed, police board records, census records, and the like. And I was also very interested in the category of violence because the book that I ended up publishing in 2021, which my dissertation was based on, was about gender and about violence. in Natchez and about the community, and as well as movement, various aspects of movement in the community, physical movement, people moving into Natchez from other places in the United States, other places, Africa, the Caribbean. There was even one woman, Margaret Anderson, who was from Ireland. So the physical movement, also metaphysical movement, across the color line. There were many free Black people who were passing as white during this time period. So I was very interested in that and the reasons for doing that, which a lot of times involved escaping slavery, preventing themselves and their family members from being either re-enslaved or enslaved if they had been born free. And then also movement between legal states. So it was extremely possible, and there were many examples out of this community of 1,000, over 1,000 individuals who were either born enslaved, received their freedom, but then who became re-enslaved again for a number of things. If they were accused of a crime, if they failed to pay their taxes, if they were taken up as a runaway and imprisoned, or there were numerous instances of people who were kidnapped over time. So this category of violence is also a really important one. And looking at again, the issue of being enslaved, I view as an act of violence because of all the attendant abuses that came within that system. Obviously, it's a system that depended upon force to keep people enslaved, to keep people within under the control of enslavers. And then imprisonment, as some people were imprisoned for being accused of crimes, being accused of being runaways, and that kind of thing. So there were a number of categories of violence. So that's an earlier iteration of the database. And then this is as it stands currently. And you can see there's a lot of expansion. Sorry, let me just scroll up to the top. We can still see that first person that I had listed from the second database that I just showed to you, but I did add a unique identifier field at the beginning just to keep everybody straight, a unique identifier. And then I expanded some of the fields, again, surname if it was known, married surname, because women, many times my understanding of them changed if I encountered them earlier before they became before they were married. And then first name, aliases, the sex that they were, their approximate birth year, their birthplace, if their mother and father were known, their mother's and father's races, their death date, their race as it was listed either on the census or in other documents, if they were a freeborn person, the date that they were first recorded in Natchez, the year that they were manumitted, if they were born enslaved and made free, and then the method of freedom, which I can show on another sheet, because I did try to code within this database, and I eventually would like to make this a lot more user-friendly and searchable than it currently stands right now. And so the manumitter's race, in other words, there are many, many categories that do go on. And then I did split out that category of violence that was all in one column in the second database, so that if the person was assaulted, if they were accused of a crime, if there was a threat of deportation that they were subjected to, if they were experiencing domestic abuse in their household, graduated freedom, or as it's also known, term slavery. So a lot of times people would have an agreement that they would be freed at a certain age, usually 21, sometimes 28. And many times those people were taken out of the jurisdiction in which that paperwork had been drawn up, whatever state it might have been, and they were taken away and kept for longer than the term that they were supposed to be. And then also if they were imprisoned, if they were indentured, if they were kidnapped, if their property were threatened. In a number of cases, people did lose their property, or they had to go to court, as Fanny Leeper did, and fight for it if they were re-enslaved. And then also if they were sexually exploited. And, as you can imagine, knowing what we know about enslavement, a great number of women were sexually exploited. And I've got that divided up into 3 different categories that I absolutely have proof that they were, or it's likely or probable, but a number of women were. So in the remaining minute or so that I have left, I do want to show the index of free people. And this is the current iteration of this. So when I was looking at the free property owning women, I believe it was 29 pages, just based on those 58 or so women. Now it's 575 pages, and it's essentially, it starts again with that same man, Aaron, that we saw in the database. And all the documents, which in his case, I only had one, and it's his emancipation documents to every person in the database, and all the documents that I've got. And excuse me, this, I did go back. I just changed this index, and I highlighted wherever slavery is mentioned. And that's what I really would like to emphasize in this last minute or so, is that these kinds of states of being a free people of color, slavery was such an important and intertwined aspect of it that, as I said, sometimes people were born enslaved and they ended up getting manumitted and receiving their freedom. Sometimes they were born free and they became enslaved. Sometimes people experienced, a changing of those states over time. And then sometimes, as in the case of the Johnsons and many of the other people, they actually held slaves themselves. So, the database and the index do go hand in hand with one another. So if it's all right with you, can I just go one more minute and just point out a few more features of the database, or I'm sorry, of the website, because I really did not get a chance to. One more minute, just really quickly. I would really encourage you, because I was afraid that I wouldn't have time to really go into all of the aspects of this work. But one thing that I would say that is vitally important, it is the telling of the stories of various people. So if you did get on this website in advance of the talk, that story that I started out with about Fanny Leeper might have seemed very familiar. And it is one of the featured stories that I have. In addition to writing about her in my master's thesis, I also published a biography of her in the African American National Biography Project back in 2008. And recently, I've become involved with the Enslaved Project out of enslaved.org out of Michigan State University. And I added her story along with 4 other women to their stories on that website. So that is, like I said, I have a very dear place in my heart for Fanny Leeper. And then I think it's very important. Another aspect of this website is just naming people, because sometimes they were literally just a name in the census, and that's really the only sense we get of them. In the census of 1816 and of 1818 in Natchez, it would just list the head of a household and mention that they were a free Negro. So a lot of times we do just have a name for people. But I also, at Queen's University Belfast, I've been very lucky to have public history interns at the master's level that have come to work with me. And so they, along with me and with Pierce McGee, who was not one of my public history interns, but he was the master's student that helped create this website, we created some case studies of some of these people. And so we put them on here. So that is a feature of the website. The database, I did publish this as a data article through enslaved.org and in their Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation last year. So if you are interested, I know I just gave a very cursory look at that database. There's the link to the data article, and within it, you can get into the database. I am not skilled at this point to incorporate the database into my website. I will have to do that at a later time. There's also an interactive map to give you an idea of where some of these people lived in Natchez. And then those case studies, there were about 20 case studies or so that I developed. And this gives you an idea of that and where they were located within Natchez, if they owned property, or some of them had court cases, or they were held in the jail in Natchez. Okay, sorry, I can't get out of this. Now I can't seem to get out of this. Okay, I will stop there because I seem to be, this is how I think the 19th century tries to call me back at various times when it comes to technology. So I will stop right there. There is quite a bit that I left unsaid about this community of color, but I just do want to emphasize again that permeability between enslavement and freedom, the challenges that they faced as free people of color, but the tenacity with which they really, their lives were really kind of defined by in the defense of themselves, keeping themselves free, and their property, their family members, and their communities. So that is where I end, and I hope to take some questions from you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you for sharing your kind of, I guess, 2 decades worth of research and painstaking construction of the details of these people's lives, the effort of listing, which I totally agree with. That effort of listing is really important. Attempts to kind of formalize complex historical research and your work to evidence the violence in your data as forms of storytelling and honoring, and also your collaborations with the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, which I think has become a really important venue for some of this work in recent years. I know there's a question from Kelvin in the chat, but I'll come to that in a second, just while others are thinking. Please, if you have questions, do drop them in the chat. I wondered if you could, I'd want to just go back to Fanny Leeper really quickly. And you mentioned something about Fanny Leeper, about the difference how people perceived her when they sort of saw her as opposed to spoke to her, and it made me jump to a classic book in information studies, Borker and Starr's Sorting Things Out, where they have a chapter on apartheid and the kind of the racial classification that took part in apartheid South Africa, ultimately why it was a nonsense, and their reflections on kind of the reflections using that to reflect on the kind of the difficulty of classifying social categories and sort of people's identity, whether it's self-constructed or constructed by others. And what I could see when you were showing the different versions of your spreadsheets, which was sort of, I've never had someone do that, and it's really kind of illuminating. You kind of you gradually creating a granularity of the way you're trying to represent people's lives, a kind of a sort of a proliferation of kind of classificatory structures and sort of properties that are trying to create meaning for you as a historian. And I wondered if you could just reflect a little on your work of trying to sort of figure out how to organize people. You're, I guess, resisting of that at different points, because I'm sure there'll be lots of resisting in the work you're doing of kind of trying to classify people's lives, and how that helped you think ultimately as a historian. Because it sounds like to me that you've got on one hand a sort of public facing database of free people of color. On the other hand, you've created a tool over the years for you to think through ultimately spreadsheets. And I wonder if you could reflect on how that process has gone back and forth for you over the last 2 decades.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. So, in a highly racialized society like the United States, and Natchez is a very interesting case study because it was governed by four different international bodies. So it was founded under the French in the 1700s, the early 1700s, 1716, and then it actually came under British jurisdiction, and then it fell into the hands of the Spanish in 1779. And these are the two periods that I look at, 1779 to 1795, when the Spanish controlled Natchez, and then when the Americans acquired the territory of the Natchez district. And they held it obviously until present day, and it was a territory until 1817. And then I look at it up until the end of the Civil War. But, it really depended on the people themselves that controlled it, because the Spanish tended to have a more, of all four of the European groups that held it, there were more opportunities for freedom and for full expression of people of color under Spanish law. So Spanish enslaved people did have the right, if they were being abused, to appeal to the court. There was also a process of manumission where they did not necessarily have to have the cooperation of their enslaver. If they had the purchase price that was decided upon by the court, then they could purchase themselves out of slavery. And when the Americans took the Natchez district in 1795, that right of enslaved people really largely disappeared. Mississippi also, as a society at different times, defined, race differently. So, and there's such a level of ambiguity among this population, because although you might have laws that spelled things out very strictly about what free Black people could and could not do, you can always find exceptions to those rules. So, for example, there were a number of things that people couldn't do, occupations that they were barred from, including publishing, including leading a house of worship. They couldn't trade outside of the city limits because there was a fear that they would be cooperating with enslaved people and possibly become involved with encouraging insurrections, uprisings, and that kind of thing. So there were those kinds of restrictions, but there were always exceptions to the rule. So just to give you an example, you mentioned Fanny Leeper and being interested with the way that she was perceived by her appearance, but then how sometimes there could be some dissonance with the way that she spoke, the way that she was socialized, and that kind of thing. There's another example of the Barland family, and they're actually on the cover of my book, which I won't share my screen again, but a very well-known family within Natchez. Elizabeth Barland was described as a mulatto woman, and she and her four children were purchased by and emancipated on the same day by a Scottish man named William Barland. And Elizabeth and William went on to have 8 more children together for a total of 12. And William Barland distinguished himself in so far as acknowledging his relationship with Elizabeth. He called her my friend and companion. He left property to her and to the 12 children and openly acknowledged them. as his children, which a lot of times white men that were the fathers of free Black people would use euphemisms, to describe, that they were manumitting people because of their faithful service and that kind of thing. So one of the sons, Andrew Barland, out of this relationship, petitioned the Mississippi state legislature in 1824 for legal whiteness. And he said in his petition that, his mother, he admitted that his mother was a free Black woman, that his father was white, that he was raised in the principles that so many of the white citizens of Natchez were raised with the sort of education. He was a slaveholder himself. He was married to a white woman, and there were a number of Natchez residents that signed his petition. And so we do have that sort of ambiguity of treatment with people. But then again, we have others that were re-enslaved or sold into slavery if they had been free. And some people that were forced out of Natchez for engaging in various activities, whether it was selling alcohol to enslaved people, trading with enslaved people, keeping an unlicensed, a business, a tavern, and that kind of thing. So it is, that's really one of the things that I come down to at the end of looking at this community is the great ambiguity, the areas of grayness that existed.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Kelvin, who I think I can unmute. There you go.
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
It was terrific presentation. Thank you very much for that. And I'm just really impressed with your life's work. And I'm just reflecting on how valuable it is and how important it is that we retain this work just in case you disappear one day. And we would all love to carry on using what you've done. So if I'm right, the database is the spreadsheets. Is that correct? It isn't a database behind it that's produced the spreadsheets.
Yes, absolutely.
So I was wondering how we could work to link your index to the database and then the database back to the evidence that you actually saw in your work. So in other words, how would I know if I clicked on one of the cells in your database, where do I go to find that record that you saw?
That's, again, this is me as somebody that, I can turn my computer on and off. Okay, I'm kidding a little bit, exaggerating, but, this is something that although I've spent so much time researching and writing on these people, I have really found it challenging to be trained in digital methods and that kind of thing. So this is where the experts need to step in. And I gave a presentation in 2019 at one of enslaved.org's conferences on databases. And I was joking that I need somebody to hold my hand. But that's why, for me, the database and the index are so deeply intertwined with one another that if somebody, if I disappear, then I really would like somebody to look at both of those tools side by side so that they can see, because essentially I took whatever documentation and transcribed it and then extracted that and inserted that into the database. So they are very intertwined with one another. So yeah, it's, again, I just need more hours in a day, I feel like, because I mentioned that there was one woman, Margaret Anderson, who was born in Ireland. And as much as, I think I definitely am an OCD kind of person, being, this involved with Natchez for so many years, something is definitely going to keep me related to that, because my next project is looking at enslaved and free people in Natchez and Irish-born people, immigrants who came to Natchez. And, it falls along the spectrum of people that were enslavers who were born in Ireland. And at this point, I've identified around 66 enslavers, but then the other side of the spectrum are family members, what I would say in a modern sense, a 21st century understanding of allies to these people who help them extricate themselves from slavery, and then people who were in business with enslaved and free Black people who vouched for them and that kind of thing. So that's my next project that I'm trying to get into. And then also Bill Hart, who is retired from the University of Ulster, spent a number of decades, very similar to me, combing through the records in Natchez. He combed through records in Ireland looking for the presence of Africans and African descended people living in Ireland. So myself and a couple of collaborators, Jonathan Wright from Maynooth University and Mark Doyle from Middle Tennessee State, we are in the process of working with Bill trying to digitize that database. And, there are many people. Bill estimated that he thought there were around 3,000 people of African descent living in Ireland. So yeah, one of these days, Kelvin, I would really like to, become more sophisticated than just using an Excel sheet to document these people. So
Thanks,
yeah.
Nick. And I mean, it's one of those classic examples of, historians and the skill sets that we come with. And ultimately, what you've been doing is amazing. And I think by connecting with the communities you have already, I'm sure some of that labor of converting what is in your head and what you've worked on surely will gradually make its way into other areas. That means it can be used. So, don't be too harsh on yourself. We have a couple of questions from Jamie Lucas Campbell in the chat, which I just want to make sure we come to, and I'll just read them out. So, and thank you so much, Jamie Lucas. So, the first question is, may you reflect a bit more on your coding process? There are so many categories. Did the breakdown for some of those columns evolve over time? And they're really curious about your process. And then the second point they ask is, could you elaborate a little more on Fanny's experience with the legal system, particularly after she sued for her property? So two very different questions. So maybe take the first, and then we'll come on to Fanny, and then we'll probably close at that point.
Thank you, Jamie Lucas. I'm going to share the screen one more time. I apologize. I did have to get out of it because I couldn't find my way back to my website. Okay, hold on though. I do want to show my coding sheet because that is a very good question. Actually, hold on. I have to pull that back up. Oh, goodness. And it is on, when I took you under the database tab on my website, and it linked with my Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation article. That would take you back, but I'll pull it up right now just so I can show it to you. Sorry, just want to make sure. Put it there. Okay. All right, Jamie Lucas, here is the very long answer to your very short question. So this is the raw data from all of the different fields that I've got. So as I said, there were 1,022 free Black people in Natchez, and 837 of them I do have their surname, and then there were 185 blanks. Married surname, first names, this is just the raw data. There was a slight imbalance of women to men. And when I say women, I do use female and male just because some of them were infant girls, infant boys, children, and that kind of thing. So females to male, 529 to 491. The birthplaces, most of the people that I know of were born in Mississippi, but there were a number of people. Virginia and Louisiana had the highest number of people outside of Mississippi, but this is always inevitably going to be the biggest number, the blanks, the unknowns, and that is just the nature of this community, sadly, that so much of the documentation is very scattered in pieces. So getting to the coding. So the first one was method of freedom. So in that column, I had numbers 1 through 8. So if they were born free, it was a number 1. 2, if they were freed by a free Black or enslaved family member. And we can see there were 30 individuals that were freed by a free Black family member. If they were freed by deed that originated in Mississippi or out of the state, freed by a will, a freedom suit, and there were 74 freedom suits. And some of these were kidnapping cases where people were kidnapped from places, places in Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Indiana, a lot of times northern states, but then there were also cases where they were kidnapped from Georgia and other places, and they were able to present their cases in front of the court. Some of them won, some of them did not, some of them the outcome was unclear. So that's a little of that coding. And then there's more things. I can either send this to you, or if you want to access my article online, you can find it there too. It's really up to you, Jamie Lucas. And let me stop sharing that. And then the second part of your question with Fannie, so the Mississippi High Court of Errors and Appeals did decide with the testimony of several people in Natchez, some of whom were, pretty prominent citizens of Natchez, including a man named Gabriel Titchener, who was, when I mentioned William Johnson, the barber of Natchez, upon whom so many people know about the free Black community because of his diary, because of his house that still stands. His wife, Ann Battles Johnson, was the likely daughter of Gabriel Titchener. He was a banker, and he eventually moved up to Cincinnati. But he vouched for Fannie Leeper, along with her former enslaver, Margaret Overraker, and some other people, saying that, yes, she indeed was freed, but the paperwork was lost. And so the Mississippi High Court of Error and Appeals did decide that that was her legitimate property, that she was defrauded out of it, and they found in her favor. And unfortunately, that's where I lose the track of Fannie Leeper. So in spite of, the tools of Ancestry.com, which has so many documents that people have put online, family trees and that kind of thing, and digging in the archives, I could not come up with anything else. So that's kind of where the trail goes cold, disappointingly. That's why if I could talk to any person who is not currently with us, it would be Fannie Leeper to answer that question.
What a lovely way to end. Thank you so much, Nik. Can we just thank Nik briefly for a really wonderful talk? I can see people are in the chat. This is the last IHR Digital History Seminar of 2023. We will be back for 2024-25 for our, I think we're now up to nearly 15th year, 13th year next year. And we'll have many talks, some of which I'm sure will be the sort of things that Nik is talking about in terms of database construction and thinking around that. Others which will be more thinking about the analytics around using that kind of data. If people are interested in the Digital History Seminar, the best way to find us is to look up the seminar online and to join our mailing list, the link to which I'll put in the chat. But for today, thank you once again to Nik, and I hope to see many of you again in the new academic year. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Really appreciate the questions and the attendance. Thank you.